They weren't kidding when they said there would be a decent turnout. This is a lot more people than we get to a lot of presentations in Oxford, so it's great to see the effective altruist community here thriving so much. As Lucia said, I'm going to focus today not so much on Giving What We Can or 80,000 Hours, the two organisations that run through the Centre for Effective Altruism in Oxford. I'm going to talk more about animal charity evaluators. And I should warn you that this is all completely new material that I made for today. I haven't presented any of these slides before. So there could be some rough edges, and if so, I apologize for that. I also wasn't quite sure where to pitch the material, so I've done a range of different things, so hopefully, even if some of it is boring, you'll find some of it interesting. Just to give you an idea of what we're going to talk about, I'm going to begin by describing animal charity evaluators. Some of you might be familiar with this organisation under its previous name, which is Effective Animal Activism. I'm going to talk about who we are, two research projects that we're currently running, and some of our future plans, and some of the questions that we have about what our priorities should be. After that, I'm going to talk about the reason that I'm optimistic about the future for animals, and what I think, and why I think that optimism shows us that there are a couple of perhaps really big opportunities for helping animals that are currently being neglected. And lastly, I'm going to talk about a thorny issue, which is how to compare the importance of different animal species, which will interest some people who might not have been interested in the previous things. So first, a bit of background on me. Lucia, well, whenever you get an introduction like that, you can be sure that everyone will be, in fact, disappointed because you can't live up to the long list of things that you've done, supposedly. But a bit of background on me. I've been very influenced by Peter Singer, as a lot of effective altruists have been, and Jeremy Bentham. I read a lot about those philosophers in my teens, which led me to start thinking about how I could make the biggest difference in the world. Also other utilitarians like John Stuart Mill. I then encountered Eliezer Yudkowsky and Les Wrong and Overcoming Bias and things like that, other people who you might well be familiar with, Robin Hanson. And of course, when GiveWell started, another organisation I expect many of you know, I realised that there was a lot of good to be done by doing research to find the highest value opportunities for doing good in the world. And it showed that there was a clearer path towards doing these things, where previously they'd just been rough ideas in my mind. I studied biology and then economics in Australia at the Australian National University. I worked for a while in the government doing research, which was kind of nice, but I didn't really feel like I was making the biggest difference that I could. And when I saw that the effective altruist movement was really growing and thriving in Oxford, I applied to become part of it. I initially moved over and was doing the research for Giving What We Can that Lucius mentioned. Recently, I've just moved on. I'm now executive director of CEA, so I'm doing a lot of management and strategy and fundraising and the big picture stuff. I also, earlier this year, became a board member of Animal Charity Evaluators. That was about in April when we hired our executive director. And that's what I'm going to talk a bit about now. So the background on ACE. It was started in last April. It came out of 80,000 hours, which I won't describe that much here. Ilan Fisher was doing an internship at 80,000 hours. He was very focused on animals. At the time, there, at least in the English-speaking world, wasn't an effective altruist animal organization. So we decided to start one. They created the website, they created the idea, came up with some project plans. It went into hibernation for a while when Ilan went back to continue his studies at Princeton. But gradually it attracted enough funding to hire an executive director, John Bockman, who started in March or April this year. In June we gained our 501c3 status, so now we're a tax-deductible charity in the United States. And just recently we decided to rebrand as Animal Charity Evaluators because we think that name will be more effective for us. The goal that we settled on is to find and promote the best ways to help animals, which is very open-ended. So we're basically open to anything. Some people think that we're mostly focused on promoting veganism, and at the moment both of the charities that we recommend primarily promote veganism. But in fact, we're interested in all ways that could help animals. We're concerned not only with animals on farms, but also wild animals. And we think that the best intermediate goal for helping those animals is to promote anti-speciesism. Currently, the best way to do that seems to be vegan outreach or vegan promotion, but we would be open to other options later on. We're currently starting with less ambitious, more manageable projects so that we can gain a track record and gain some experience and gain credibility, but we're hoping to build up and gain a full picture of how people can effectively help animals in the future. So as I said, the founders are Ilan Fisher and Ben Todd, who runs 80,000 Hours. The board is now Brian Tomasic, me, and Simon Knudsen. Brian Tomasic, many of you will know, he's very prolific online, animal advocate and utilitarian. Simon Knudsen was a past employee of GiveWell, so he has a research background. And our executive director is John Bockman, who's been an animal advocate in the United States for many years. Now, the first thing to talk about whenever you're talking about animal charity is to get across the fact that the effectiveness of different ways of helping animals varies really dramatically. It's not just, something is twice as effective as something else. It's more like 10 or 100-fold, even just in terms of the immediate impact. And in fact, the most popular ways of helping animals are probably the least effective, the ones that we should really be discouraging people from engaging in. And I'm just going to come up with 3 different examples, all things that our executive director has done in the past. So shelter animals in the United States, at least, it costs about $300 per animal to adopt them out. And the shelter loses money on every animal that it helps. So you're talking about $300 per dog that you're assisting. It's quite a lot of money. For wild animals, if you want to find injured wild animals, rehabilitate them and release them again, the average cost, at least where John Bockman was previously working, was about $30 per animal. And you'd also have to consider the harm of feeding the animals meat if they're carnivores, and the suffering and that they might experience or inflict when they're released back into the wild. We're talking about a large amount of money. But if you focus on farm animals, the figure is dramatically lower. Leafleting costs about $11 per 100 leaflets, at least according to Vegan Outreach. According to a farm sanctuary study, Farm Sanctuary being a charity that does vegan outreach, about 100 leaflets at a college given to freshmen results in 1 new vegetarian. The average vegetarian lasts 5 to 7 years, according to Nick Cooney, in his new book. He had cited 3 studies in there coming up with that range. The average person in the United States eats about 30 animals per year, most of them chickens. And so you'd think that 100 leaflets, or for $10, you could cause 150 to 210 fewer animals to be consumed in total. It's just 100 times cheaper, or more than 100 times cheaper than the other options that are presented here, which attract the vast majority of the resources that are going towards helping animals at the moment. Now, this number is probably an overestimate. I expect this to be pulled back as we get a clearer idea of the actual effectiveness. But you can immediately halve it because there's this elasticity of demand effect where if some people stop eating meat, the price of meat goes down and some other people start eating more. So that will roughly halve it. And I also think that there's a bit of publication bias that charities that get good results like this, that 100 leaflets creates a vegetarian, are more likely to publish the results than a group that gets a negative result. And there's also a bit of a winner's curse. But there's been at least a couple of studies of different animal charity interventions. This is the one that comes out looking very good. Probably, if you're selecting from the things that have the best apparent results, it's probably you've gotten a bit lucky in that study. You end up with something called the winner's curse, where you go for the thing that you think is best, and it turns out that it's not as good as that later on. However, I still think that farm animals is going to be far and away better than helping pets or rehabilitating wild animals. And this shouldn't surprise anyone because 99% of the animals that are killed by humans, in the United States at least, is for food. It's not for vivisection or experiments or for fur or in shelters or anything like that. It's the vast number in factory farms. Is this an okay pace? This is good? Yeah? Okay. So where are the animals? Who are they? Worldwide, there's about 1 trillion fish caught each year. Obviously, the vast majority of them are extremely small. That's about 100 billion kilograms. Worldwide, there's about 19 billion chickens who are killed each year. There's about 1 billion pigs, 1 billion cows, and for wild mammals, it's very hard to say exactly how many, but somewhere between 100 billion and 1 trillion or so. I know you've had a talk recently about wild animals, but most people who think about wild animals expect that their lives are probably not very good in general, particularly because so many young animals die extremely early. They're born, and then after a couple of hours, days, weeks, they die of starvation. It's just a very tragic fact of biology. So which species have it worst? The consensus seems to be, I haven't looked into this that much myself, and I'm afraid ACE hasn't yet either, but the consensus seems to be that farmed fish have a particularly bad situation because they're kept in very cramped conditions, often not very sanitary. They're shitting into the same water that they're swimming in, and they get many diseases. Battery and broiler chickens are constrained. They seem very stressed and unhappy. Pigs also have a pretty bad lot. They are often constrained into very small spaces, and they probably have greater needs for companionship and stimulation than other species do. Going up the list, sheep probably don't have it as bad as the others, but it's still not so good. And cows probably have it the best. And possibly cows are even doing good, because farms in which you raise cattle displace wilderness, they displace wild animals who might have worse lives than the farmed cows do. So that just gives you some idea of the big picture. What are the early conclusions that people have reached about animal charity? I think the most common views among effective altruists concerned with animals are that we should mostly talk about farm animals at this point, that we should focus on chickens and fish just because they're vastly more numerous and their lives are worse, and that we should try to make people care about all animals by using veganism as a way of promoting anti-speciesism. And that's currently where our recommendations stand, although it's early days. Now, possibly we should deprioritize research at this point. Maybe this is just this is actually a lot of value contained here. This is very different from what most animal advocates are doing. We think what they're doing is a waste of time compared to this. If only we could convince most animal advocates in the United States to switch to this, then we'd be doing a lot of good. And some think that that is the best approach, that we should just take this wisdom and then spread the word. And possibly we will do that, and I expect that there are other people there are other people who are doing that. But at least for now, we're going to push ahead with doing more research in order to get a better idea of the effectiveness of different approaches for talking about farm animals and spreading anti-speciesism. So our goals in the short term with our research are to generally advance knowledge about the effectiveness of different animal interventions. At the moment, there really is a dearth of knowledge. The Vegan Outreach and the Humane League, which we currently recommend, there's only half a dozen studies that really back up the approaches that they're taking, and they're not of very high quality, although I think common sense says that probably what they're doing is working quite well. But it would be good to get some really rigorous studies so that we can go out with confidence and say, these are the kind of results that you expect per dollar. We want to model good research to animal charities. Most animal charities today don't do cost-effectiveness research. They don't evaluate their projects terribly well. We would like to demonstrate that this can be done. It can be done well. You can learn useful things from it and adapt to that knowledge. I would also like to build the academic respectability of this work. We'd like to demonstrate that this can be done so that other academics who are studying marketing or psychology or thinking brain science or whatever else might want to come in and contribute to this body of knowledge, so we can, put the first brick in the wall, and then hopefully others will join. And our philosophy is very much to work with other animal groups and research experts. We're a small organization. A lot of animal organizations are quite small, and would like to encourage or help other people to do good with the money and resources that they have as much as possible. And we want to prioritize questions that other groups aren't currently working on. So there are some charities that are looking at their interventions and how they can change them in small ways to make them better. Because that is already being done to some extent, we're more focused on which interventions work in absolute terms at all. So not so much which flyer is better than another flyer, but does flyering work at all compared to, say, speeches, talks, and things like that. A current project that we have running is to look into leafleting. Now, leafleting is a really popular and promising approach. There's some evidence that it works very well. It's the approach that our current recommended charities take. A lot of volunteers like to go to campuses and hand out flyers. But as I said, there's not a huge amount of research to give you a good quantitative estimate of the impact. Currently, there's a study from the Humane League that, I'm trying to think, which one is that? That was done late last year by Nick Cooney, who came here. It was a fairly small sample, about 500 students. The main problem that we had with that and with the farm sanctuary study was that it was very clear when people were surveyed that this was an animal organization that was coming and asking them whether they ate meat. And we expect that there's going to be a really big social desirability bias. That if you say, we're Vegan Outreach, do you eat meat? People are going to say that they eat meat less than they do, and that the reason you're getting a strong response of people saying, yes, I haven't eaten chicken lately, is just that they're telling you what you want to hear. And in these surveys, you're picking up fairly small responses. So you survey, say, 100 people, and you find that 4 of them are vegetarian. If the social desirability bias makes 6 people say that they're vegetarian, then you're going to think, wow, we've just created 2 new vegetarians. And you only need like 2% of people to kind of lie a bit, and they certainly do lie, in order to totally throw your results. So you have to be quite careful, otherwise you could be very misled by these various biases. We have a pretty good idea of the cost of doing leafleting because Vegan Outreach has kept good track of that. The volunteers mostly don't charge, it's just a question of distributing the leaflets, which have a set cost. We use academic and industry sources to look at the elasticity of demand, so the economics of it, how much people are eating on average, how much different kinds of people are eating, that's on the record. We also have some research on persuasion, the kind of things that, again, Nick Cooney has done in his book, Change of Heart, to work out whether these results seem sensible, whether they are compatible with other things that, other persuasion studies that have been done. And of course, anecdotes, it's helpful to know that people do come back sometimes to these leafleters and say, you made me vegetarian or you made me vegan. That can actually be quite persuasive, or at least confirm your result rather than make you think that you're crazy. So as I said, there's 2 existing studies that we looked at earlier this year when we were deciding to run another study. Farm Sanctuary had this study of about 500 students who had received leaflets. The problem was that when they came back to survey them 2 weeks later, they screened by asking them whether they had seen the leaflet, which put it into their mind and will create this social desirability bias. The other problem is that they're going back only 2 weeks later, which is probably a little bit soon. There's probably quite a lot of people who will read a leaflet like that and cut back on their meat consumption for 2 weeks, but then won't stick with it for very long. You really want to come back months later, ideally perhaps years later, and see how many people you've persuaded. I also had some concerns about the precise questions that they'd asked. They had a whole range of different, they said like, have you reduced your consumption of chicken? Have you reduced your consumption of cows? Have you reduced your consumption of pig? And they highlighted particular results from that were good, but shockingly some people said that they'd increased their consumption of these products, and they weren't really quite sure what to do with that. Maybe people are just taking the piss. I'm not sure if there's an equivalent expression in Swiss or German. People might just have been winding them up because they don't like vegan outreach organizations. Or maybe not. Until you get them to answer without knowing what the study is about, it's very hard to read those results. It was also, I think it's better to ask people, what did you eat yesterday or what did you eat today, than it is to say, have you changed your consumption this way or that. There's a lot of research suggesting that about 10% of the population will say that they're vegetarian, and then about half of them will say that they ate meat yesterday, if you ask them that follow-up question. And so you want to be careful with the precise wording, and people are much more honest when you say, what have you eaten, rather than more nebulous things like, are you vegetarian? The Humane League is one of our recommended organizations, and it's currently doing quite a large assessment of 8 different leaflets to work out which ones are relatively more effective. That's going to be really helpful research. It's possible that some of the leaflets are much better than others. But that's not going to, but because you're only doing these relative comparisons, you're not dealing with the absolute level of bias. It's not going to help us to say how leafleting compares to non-leafleting approaches. So what are the features of the ACE study? How did we deal with those problems? It's quite a big sample. We're going across 8 different colleges, and we've got volunteers following pretty strict guidelines at all of those different campuses. They're in different states across the United States, so we're not going to pick up a particularly unusual population, hopefully. In order to give us a control, we decided to also distribute leaflets about puppy mills. I'm not sure if you know what puppy mills are. They're like factories, I guess, where puppies are bred as pets, and they're particularly bad conditions, and there's concern about this in the United States. Some states have started to outlaw them. But this doesn't talk about what you should eat at all. It doesn't mention diet whatsoever. And we thought that this would be a good control to get people thinking about animals, but not thinking about their diet, and not going to prompt them to want to respond to the survey in a different way. it also helps us to control for people who are more likely to pick up flyers. Because you imagine that people who receive flyers are probably different, more socially involved, more likely to be activists, or more likely to be concerned about animals than people who don't. And making sure that you're comparing yourself to another group of very similar people who also took a leaflet about animals and read it, but it didn't talk about diet, gives you a good comparison group, basically. We're going to return 2 months later in December. We've just started doing this. Going to return 2 months later. That gives us a pretty good amount of time. We'll see whether people actually remember the leaflet. And most importantly, the surveyors won't identify the survey as related to the leaflet that was distributed 2 months ago. It's going to be just a neutral dietary survey. And then at the end, there's going to be an instruction to go and talk to the person who's giving the survey. We're going to show them a page with a bunch of different rough designs of leaflets in a particular color, some of which match the leaflets that we've distributed. They're going to have very different colorful designs. And then we'll ask them, have you seen any of these leaflets in the last few months? And if they pick out the ones that we did distribute, then we have good evidence that they've seen them, and then we ask them how much they read it. But you also have a problem that people might report seeing the leaflet, even if they didn't. They might misremember it. People have not terribly good memories for these things. If they can pick out the correct color scheme, that is stronger evidence that they actually did see it, because it's like a criminal lineup. You can recognize the particular scheme. Now, this might seem a bit over the top, but like I said, because we're trying to pick up small changes in what people are eating, small errors can just totally destroy the results. So you want to have a high quality study. And this is probably, I think it's almost certainly going to be the highest quality study of this kind ever done, if we follow through on our plans correctly. Let's see, I bet I've said that. Yeah, it's going to include other questions about diet, like caffeine and sugar. So what's the next example? Another common approach that veg outreach groups take is to go to schools or go to colleges and give lectures to a bunch of students. So we've got a study with a bunch of our partners or a bunch of charities that do this. At every time they go to primary school or high school to deliver one of these lectures, they're going to collect email addresses from all of the students. Now, you don't want to have a sampling bias in there, so we've offered a $500 prize if they go into a raffle if students give us their email address. And because they're quite young, $500 seems like a lot, and I think well over half of them have actually given us their email, so we have a pretty good sample, at least at that point. We don't have to worry about the bias in the sample of people who are receiving these lectures, because they have to go to them because they're in their class. They've persuaded the teachers to allow them to deliver these lectures about animal welfare and about veganism. And then we're going to use these emails. We're going to send them another of these neutral surveys. It's not going to be clear who it's coming from. We're going to offer them a prize if they respond, and we'll just ask them about their diet, and we'll compare it with another group of students who are from the same school, but were not in any of these lectures because their teachers didn't opt to give it to them, and we'll give them the same survey. We've been collecting their email addresses using the same approach, or leaving flyers around asking them to put their email in order to receive a prize, and we've been getting good responses. And of course we check to make sure that there's people aren't in the wrong group. We ask them at the end of the survey whether they actually attended one of these lectures. So this is going to give us a decent idea about whether this lecture approach in primary schools or high schools is causing people to eat less meat, at least 2 months later. And to my knowledge, there hasn't really been any quantitative work on this question or on this intervention at all. So it's possible that it will turn out to be much more effective than leafleting, or perhaps much less. Or maybe the study won't work for some reason that we haven't thought about, in which case we'll have to go back and plan a new study. For both projects, we're working with various partners: Mercy for Animals, Compassionate Action for Animals, the Humane League, Vegan Outreach, all pretty good effectiveness-focused charities in the United States. We're also talking with Statisticians Without Borders, which I hadn't heard of until this project, but they're a group of statisticians who do charity work, help people to do research like this and do it really thoroughly, and they're happy with our design, which is a very good sign. You could go on our website now and read the study methodology and the official protocol that we're following. as well as copies of the materials and the instructions that we've given to people to make sure that they do this properly. And also we've pledged to report the results when we get them, which is going to be December, January for the leafleting study, and February, March for the humane education study. Now, who do we recommend? What do we think that you can do now to help animals? It's very early days. We've only been around for about a year. We currently recommend two organizations, the Humane League and Vegan Outreach. I think these are both outstanding organizations, and there's a good chance that they'll continue to be our recommended charities for many years. The Humane League does research through its labs program, as I was saying earlier, which will be useful for improving the effectiveness of all animal advocacy. And they seem very responsive to evidence. I think something that gives me a lot of confidence is that the people running the Humane League really have the right attitude. They want to help animals. They're willing to stop doing things that don't seem to be working. They test things to see if they're working. At this point, that's one of the best things that you can see. Vegan Outreach, on the other hand, has a very big scale. They distribute almost 2 million flyers every year now. It's an extremely large group. And this gives them very low cost in their outreach. And they're enabling a lot of other groups, including the Humane League, which uses the flyers that they print and produce with their donations. So how do you choose recommendations? I wish that I could tell you that this was a science, that there was a simple formula that you could follow to do this and reliably choose the best charity. But as with all difficult decisions in a complex world, it actually requires a lot of judgment. People often disagree about what's going to be the best. And there's a lot of different sources that you could rely on that might give different answers. Expert judgment and common sense, I think, are actually very useful, perhaps more than people appreciate relative to numbers on a page. Data from the organizations themselves, if it's been collected properly, is extremely useful. There are also heuristics about what looks good. As I was saying, one of the best heuristics that you can use in judging a charity is whether you have confidence in the people that they're using a good trial and error approach, where they try something, they test it, if it works, they continue, if it doesn't work, then they stop. And there are various other guidelines that you can use to work out whether a charity is likely to be doing a good job or not. We also will have an increasing number of our own studies into which interventions work, and there's other research, particularly for poverty charities, into which approaches for reducing poverty work and which ones don't. And I could talk about that at length if you have questions later. There's related academic research, like into marketing and persuasion, and anecdotes are helpful, at least in confirming that there are some people who say that they were affected by these things. Anecdotes aren't the best evidence, but you'd like to have some anecdotes, at least in the pack. As I said, it's very difficult to choose the best charity. Our approach is going to be to publish our findings and background work transparently, including the citations and the original data as much as possible insofar as the charities will allow us. And that will help us to get feedback and to gradually improve over the years. Now, some of you might ask, what about approaches like fundraising for charity or recruiting new people to do animal advocacy? And those are indeed extremely important questions. As a vegan, probably the biggest impact you have isn't that you don't eat meat. Much more important than that is the message that you're sending in the fact that over your life you'll probably recruit many more vegetarians or vegans, or encourage meat eaters to eat less meat, or at least to think again about their attitude towards animals and perhaps become a bit less speciesist. I would think that that's probably at least 10 times more important than the fact that you actually don't eat meat. And that's a kind of it's a more meta approach, because you're thinking about what the downstream effects of your actions are, that you're recruiting more people to change their behavior as well. So there's various different multipliers that you can use here. You could find an intervention, and then you could fundraise to get people to pay people to do more of that thing. You could recruit people and convince them to do more of that thing. You could train yourself to do that thing better, just become more effective. Perhaps you could do research into how to do it better, improve your leaflets, improve your persuasiveness, or improve the words that you use, the kind of thing that we're doing. Or perhaps you could fundraise to recruit, to train fundraisers, to support research to improve fundraisers. You could stack all of these multipliers in some order, trying to get greater effectiveness. And the term that we use at the Center for Effective Altruism to describe this is meta-charity. And both of our main projects are meta-charities. Giving What We Can is basically a research and fundraising organization for anti-poverty projects. 80,000 Hours gives advice on what careers can have the biggest difference. So it's a research and recruitment charity. And I think that these approaches definitely do get you a better bang for buck. They can be very effective. But meta approaches also increase your uncertainty about the impact, and they reduce the credibility of the final numbers that come out of it, because you're stacking more parts onto the equation to work out the effectiveness, and at every point it's becoming extremely uncertain. And for that matter, the multipliers are often very hard to measure. You don't really know how many people you're recruiting or how long they're going to stay with you. Fundraising is a little bit easier. Research is very hard to say what the impact of research is most of the time. You don't know whether people are paying attention, and often you don't even know whether the research results are correct. And at some point we will need to know what we're putting multipliers in front of. There has to be some final thing that actually delivers the intervention. You can collect money, you can collect people, but then they have to do something. So as a result of these considerations, at least in the short term, we're going to focus on these ultimate interventions like leafleting or humane education or political outreach. And then later on, perhaps we'll think about fundraising and recruitment, once we have a good idea of what those resources should be put to. So what are the next steps for ACE? We've got a new website that will be launched by the end of the year with our new brand, with our new design, and our new, way of talking. We've got another round of recommendations which will come in spring 2014, and subsequently we hope that these will happen every year. We want to start tracking our money moved in order to encourage charities to take an interest in the research that we do, to participate in the evaluations, and to measure their own effectiveness in order to persuade donors like us that they should receive our money, that they're the best target. We are also encouraging other groups to do surveys on their leaflets and do properly measure their approach, so that we don't have the resources to do, at this point at least, to do a lot of final research projects on the ground, but often the charities that are doing them every day do have those resources and they do have the capability to do that. So reaching out and describing to people how they can do good research is a very high leverage way of getting more work out there. And we're working now on developing a methodology and a process for how we're going to select our charities each year. Obviously this will change over time, but we want to have a process that people can understand and that they can trust. And we've just hired our first researcher 2 months ago who'll be working on doing that. Finally, as I said, communication and transparency are very important for us. As a research organisation, we need people to have confidence in our results, otherwise they can't have any impact. And so and for that matter, we need to learn from other people and get feedback on our mistakes. We're sure to make mistakes. This is new work. People haven't really done that much research into animal charity before. So we want to publish as much as we can and find out what we're doing wrong. And this approach worked very well for GiveWell. GiveWell has had a policy of publishing a lot of the research that they do, even the things that aren't terribly good, and then they get feedback on that and they gradually improve. And now they're considered one of the authorities in the world on which charities, at least for poverty-focused people, are doing the most good. So we hope to emulate that. I might just leave ACE there a little bit and talk about my own views on some issues in animal charity with the remaining, 15 to 20 minutes. I think that there's a possible mistake that's being made in the effective altruist animal community, which just started occurring to me in the last couple of months, which is people are overwhelmingly focused on, or the metric that we've started using to decide whether something is effective or not is how many days of suffering or how many days of life in a factory farm an approach prevents per dollar that goes in. And on this measure, for example, you'd end up thinking that eating eggs is 100 times worse than eating a steak, just because chickens are much smaller and they don't produce that many eggs relative to the amount of beef that a cow produces. And absolutely, days of suffering is proportional to the bad. Twice as many days of suffering is twice as bad, I would say. But I think that this is ignoring the fact that brain sophistication varies dramatically as well as the size of animals. So a whale has a brain that's about 8 kilograms, a human has one that's about 1.4, A cow, it's 400 grams. A pig, 200 or so. Sheep, 150 grams. And chickens that we're overwhelmingly concerned with, or many people are overwhelmingly concerned with, it's 4 grams. And a mouse, 1 gram. So the cost per dollar to prevent an animal living in a farm varies a lot, but so does potentially the sophistication of the brain that you're trying to prevent from suffering. If we were to weight the importance of animals based on brain size, then in fact you end up with the reverse conclusion from chickens being the most important. If you look at all of the farm animals in the entire world, and you think of the total weight of all of the chicken brains in the world is 1, then sheep have got 1.25 times that, pigs have twice, cows it's 7.5 times, so in fact you'd think cows are dramatically more important perhaps than other species on this metric, and of course wild animals it's going to be dramatically higher. Now this is probably going too far in the other direction. A larger share of the brain in small animals like a mouse is dedicated to dealing with experience and doing basic tasks that probably involve suffering and pleasure. And there's a lot more selection pressure on the brains of small animals because they're larger as a share of their body, and inefficiency there causes much bigger problems for them. As a whale, if your brain isn't working too efficiently, it's only a tiny share of your body. It doesn't really absorb, it's not too bad for your survival. But for a small animal, evolution, like insects for example, evolution really hones their brains to work extremely effectively. But I still think that we need to find some middle ground between these two extremes. We don't want to say that a mouse is as important as a whale, or a human for that matter, but we don't, and I don't think that we should say that cows are 7 times more important than all of the chickens. Reasons to doubt this days of suffering approach. If we were to take it literally, we wouldn't just be focusing on chickens, but the tiniest and most numerous creatures like bed bugs, or ants, I guess if you're willing to accept insects, like the smaller the insect, the more they would be in number. And if you only allowed vertebrates, then would overwhelmingly be concerned with like tiny baby fish or tiny frogs that have only just been conceived that would weigh under a gram. They would just be like dramatically more important than all of the other animals in the world. And I'm like, common sense I think suggests that something has gone wrong here, and I'm really suspicious of this conclusion. So you might want to think some more about it. Another reason is that this, does anyone have a marker? Where's that? Over here? Sorry. I was just going to draw in here actually, but okay, I can do it with my hands. Oh, right. Yeah. So you could think brain sophistication on this axis. And then like importance or suffering. This kind of, this approach where you just weight it by days of suffering kind of assumes that it's all 0, 0, 0. Then you reach some level. Most people don't want to think that insects are super important. So perhaps I guess like a mouse or the very small mammal. And then it's just that. And then no matter what you do, it's just flat again. The brain weight approach would be more something like just a linear amount, where just doubling the size of the brain or doubling the complexity or the number of computations that a brain is doing doubles the importance or doubles the amount of suffering if it's just doing the same thing. I think that's more reasonable, but it's not how, like larger animals aren't going to be designed to be twice as important. So I think it's something more like that, where you get larger and you get more important but progressively less more important, or you progressively experience less, at least among existing species that we can look at. And so I want to have some middle ground. At least this approach, where it's just flat forever and you can have a brain the size of a planet and it's just the same as an ant, that seems very unlikely to me, even relative to some like superlinear approach where you double in size and you're 4 times more important, or you experience 4 times as many things. And this is quite material. It is quite important because if we really do take this literally, then we would be very, very concerned with fish and chickens, and then we really wouldn't care about cows at all. But on this other approach, we think cows are probably the most important. It's not purely a philosophical issue. Other reasons to doubt it would be if you imagine a mouse, and then you kind of imagine a mouse plus that has like the same mouse brain contained in it, but then like much more added onto it. So it's strictly larger, does everything that the smaller mouse brain does, and more things. For that to only be as important as the smaller brain seems quite surprising, given that it's a strict superset, or the smaller brain is a strict subset of the larger brain. And there's various other thought experiments that you could look up if you're interested in exploring this issue more. One of the important papers is Quantity of Experience, Brain Duplication and Degrees of Consciousness by Nick Bostrom. You could just Google that. It's on his website. So what's the way forward here? I mean, obviously we need much more research into the causes and correlates of suffering and pleasure. Well, we knew that already, but this makes it seem even more important. But the low-hanging fruit, something that we could plausibly do in the near future, would be to measure the size of the parts of the brain that are activated when processing pleasure and pain, when you eat something nice or you suffer an unpleasant experience, and then compare the size of those across different species. And I think you'd end up getting something like this logarithmic curve, and this would give us some tentative basis for comparison that isn't too extreme in either direction. But in the longer run, of course, we want to understand much better precisely what's causing suffering and how we can prevent it. So now I'll just talk about some personal views of mine on animals in the long run, some opportunities to help them, and some reasons that I'm optimistic. The first one, or a whole lot of these are to do with new technology that I think will make things better. Meat substitutes, many of you will have heard of. It's pretty likely that suffering-free meat alternatives that people can't tell the difference between them and meat are going to come in the next century if things continue to go well and the economy continues to grow. These could be either in vitro meat, something that's gotten a lot of media attention, or they could be just complete substitutes that people develop sufficiently good food science that they can produce things that taste and look and have the nutrition of meat. Either way, it doesn't really matter. These are both very promising approaches. Both of them could work. And the fact that there are two of them is all the better. This, I think, could basically end animal agriculture because this will end up being a whole lot cheaper. Growing full animals is just horrendously inefficient, environmentally, economically. It just doesn't make sense. Once we can produce the meat that we actually want, just chemically, why are we going to waste our time producing animals? It will lower the cost for people to realize that doing this is extremely inhumane. They'll think, the difference is negligible. Am I really going to torture animals for this? Something that's more expensive and doesn't taste better. So that's one thing to be very optimistic about. And it suggests that there are perhaps very high impact careers that you could take in food science or in marketing to help to bring forward the day that this happens and to make sure that it absolutely does happen. Another thing that makes me optimistic is the potential for breeding. So I think that we're going to learn to breed animals, including humans and especially humans, that love their life, that really love their lives, that have a great time. This actually isn't very difficult. We can already do this with current technology. Scientists have bred animals that produce a lot of meat, that grow very quickly. They haven't tried to select animals that are really happy, that don't suffer, that aren't anxious. But if they did that, then they could very quickly produce animals that were just in a state of ecstasy all the time. And this would obviously be a whole lot better. At least it would help, it would get us to the point where we can use in vitro meat or meat substitutes down the line. We already know, in humans at least, some alleles that are correlated with very high levels of happiness and suffering very infrequently. And also, of course, some alleles that are associated with depression and anxiety. Allele is a technical term for genetic variant for a particular gene. And I expect that future technology is going to identify very clearly the genes that cause high well-being in mammals, and then we'll be able to spread them and ensure that humans that are children have these genes so that they live good lives rather than unhappy lives, that they don't need to suffer. And then eventually this will be extremely cheap to do on any animals that we're keeping as well. So this suggests that there are unexplored opportunities in brain science and genetics to bring forward the day when we can do these things. The third thing is that I expect that we're going to gain a much better understanding of consciousness and suffering and of pleasure over the coming centuries. I'm sure this is a tricky problem, but it's not an impossible problem, as many people seem to think. Humans have done incredible things. We can sequence an entire genome for $1,000 now. I think that at some point we will be able to work out, or see enough into the brain to understand at least what is associated with pleasure and suffering. And even if we don't understand why, we'll be able to tinker with it and control experiences in a much more clear way. There's a very strong interest group to fund this kind of research. We probably won't even need charity because people don't want to suffer themselves. There's already a lot of research into anesthetics and things that will help people to prevent pain themselves. People won't want their children to be suffering. If we get close to the point where you can have children who are extremely happy rather than depressed, then there'll be a lot of money that will go into that because it's something that people will want. And atomically precise manufacturing will eventually, probably this is a long time away, but maybe thousands of years in the future, will make it possible to go out and change organisms to introduce these changes so that they don't suffer too much and that their lives are generally good, perhaps even into wild animals. And this is something, you might think that this is crazy. I sympathize, it sounds totally crazy. But there are legitimate scientists who have looked into this who think that this is a plausible scenario. So at least if you'd like to know more, talk to me. And this technology will greatly lower the cost to having compassion for all creatures and for caring about the suffering of all animals, not just ourselves. Another positive thing is that across the board, the occurrence of unintended consequences is going down. Humans can plan things in a way that wild animals can't, and they can design their environments so that accidents don't happen too much, that they can make their lives good. And this is seen in the fact that pollution and accidents per dollar of GDP produced is going way down because people don't want to have pollution, they find ways to stop it. They don't want to have accidents, they find ways to stop it. And so as a share of all human activity, unintended things is declining. And the number of helpless animals is shrinking too. There are more farm animals certainly, but there are also far fewer wild animals. And I expect that in the long run, this will continue to happen, that humans will continue to expand their influence over the biosphere. They'll continue to choose things that are happening rather than having them happen by accident, as they have for the last 4.5 billion years. And that they'll generally choose to have good things happen rather than bad things, because they don't want bad things to happen. And this suggests to me that more progress and more power for people and more technology is not as bad as it looks superficially. Perhaps you'd think people in developing countries get richer and they consume more meat, and that's true. But taking a longer term view, I'm actually very optimistic that human progress is going to lead to the elimination of suffering and to a much better world in which people get what they want. And the long-term trends fit this. The arc of history is one towards greater non-violence and greater justice in the world. We've had movements for anti-nationalism, for religious pluralism, for anti-racism, anti-slavery. Slavery is almost gone now. Sexism is on the way out, is gone or on the way out in much of the world. And now we have a rapidly growing anti-speciesist movement that can learn everything from these previous movements and then take things to the next step to not only caring about all humans, regardless of gender or race, but also care about all creatures in the world. The Better Angels of Our Nature by Steven Pinker is a really fantastic book that I read recently, and it documents in great detail this decline in cruelty and in violence and in conflict, and towards a world where humans overwhelmingly cooperate. Most of the people you meet every day do nothing to harm you. You collaborate with them, you produce value with them, you trade with them. That wasn't always the case, but it's mostly the case today. And very clearly, people are becoming more compassionate, and they also have more resources to do good. Rich people can afford to spend their money on making the world better for others and on expressing their altruistic desires. And they do. And even concern for wild animal suffering is growing quickly. A couple of years ago, there were just far fewer people who cared about this. It was a very niche thing. Now, at least in the effective altruist movement, it's considered totally normal to care about this. And the number just keeps going up. So I think this supports the anti-speciesist movement building approach, following the ideas of the abolitionist movements and the civil rights movements that have just totally transformed attitudes in society. My next point is that people are mostly neutral or good, which is something that I've been getting at. Currently, most animal suffering is just accidental or incidental or independent of people altogether in nature. Only a very small share is intended. If there were meat substitutes, people would be happy to switch to them and not have animals suffer. And people love their pets, they love animals that they're close to. They only accidentally harm animals that are far away from them. And this is obviously very good, but it's maybe even better than you realize, because it suggests that even a minority of people who really dislike suffering can prevent it. They can prevent it with political trade by bargaining their votes to get bills passed, for example, regulation on animal welfare, or anti-cruelty and anti-suffering regulations in general. Of course, in society today, you have some people who care a lot about others and some people who are more selfish. But in the political process, they trade somewhat, and the people who are very compassionate get many of the things that they want through the political process. There's also economic trade. You could simply pay people to do compassionate things, whether they want to or not, just give them money. Or even if those things don't work, then compassionate people can invent alternatives to doing bad things. For example, even if we can't convince people to care about animals and farms, we can invent meat substitutes so that they don't want to anymore. And then they'll just do it anyway. So I'm hopeful that we can make many people in the world much more compassionate than they are now. But we don't even have to get to that level. We don't need to convince everyone. All we have to do is remove the reasons that animals are incidentally suffering, remove the accidents that are causing them to suffer. Another point is just that the world is becoming a much saner place. In the 15th century, superstition, cruelty, just confusion, biases, irrationality, all of these things were completely common. There was only a very small number of people who by our standards, wouldn't be considered superstitious, confused, and cruel. But today, the world isn't perfect, but I think we've come a long way, especially among educated people in developed countries. Rich and educated people are more powerful, and they're also much more likely to be vegetarian or vegan, or in general to care about the welfare of all creatures. And although I don't think that the best thing to do is just generally to advance progress in the sense of making people more rational or promoting education, it's not going to be the best thing. We should be very happy about these broad interventions that are improving rationality and discourse and education. And this is happening all the time in the world. The 8th point is one that's very close to me. The effective altruist movement makes me very optimistic. I think that we're really changing how people think about charity, about how they do good in the world. And not just in the effective altruist movement, but across all philanthropy, across the world in general, I think you can see that people are becoming more rational about doing good. The effective altruist movement is one of the important parts of this, but people are becoming more focused on cost effectiveness in all aspects of life. It's very big in public policy, very big in development, and has been growing for decades. Why is this happening? It's hard to say. Probably just generally better education, better science, and better IT tools are part of it. There's a lot more networking of people with unusual interests these days through the internet, and sharing and writing down of accumulated knowledge so that we don't forget it. And perhaps the effective altruist movement simply started because of some lucky breakthroughs that people noticed connections between particular ideas and came up with this philosophy that then was very popular once people had stumbled on it. But for whatever reason, the effective altruist movement is going extremely well. It's producing a lot of people who are smart, who care about doing good, and who rationally care about animals. And I would expect this to only become more so in the future, because economic development is very correlated with, I would say, enlightened attitudes, with caring about the consequences of your actions and caring about pleasure and suffering. So I'm optimistic that the effective altruist movement will grow, and that as the world becomes richer, people will become more rational and more altruistic. So animal work can be very depressing because you're faced with things that are extremely sad, with great cruelty, great indifference on the part of people, with some of the worst suffering that exists in the world. But my message would be, don't be demoralized, don't burn out. There's a lot that can be done about animal welfare, and there are good reasons to think that this problem will be solved if people like us think and work hard at doing so. So thanks for your time. I can now take questions.